Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Where Do We Go From Here? It's Imran Khan, and I'm really excited to have Jovan on today. He's the co-publisher of Daddy Magazine, which is a magazine that deals with identity issues, and Joe will tell us a little bit more about that in just a second. And also going to be a staff writer on an upcoming late night German comedy series. So I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about that. So welcome, Joe. Tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work that you're doing with Daddy.
Hi, Amy. Yes, so Daddy Magazine started about 4 years ago, and I was not one of the original founders back then, but it was an online magazine where we asked people to write about issues of their experiences. So what is it like being X in a place or having Y experience? Usually more with humor to kind of get that message across. Sometimes you can't always be funny, but that is the ideal. And then I joined Daddy, I think about 2 years ago as a writer and then editor. And because we are launching our upcoming print magazine for the first time, I joined, thank you, yeah, I joined our founder and editor-in-chief, Kimi Fatoba, as publisher of the new print mag. So Daddy, it's kind of like a punk startup humor blog zine community.
I love it. That's so exciting. And that's perfect for the conversation that we're having today. So one of the reasons I asked Joe to join me for this chat is because both of us are, folks that are straddling two different cultures, living in a country that's outside of our original culture / cultural identity. And it's really interesting how a lot of the conversations around the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a global conversation. And so Germany is having its moment to start to examine what does it mean to be German and what does it mean to be, a dual identity person that's in Germany. And so hopefully we'll have some interesting anecdotes to share with you during the conversation today. So with that said, Joe, I'd really love to better understand from you, what has been the impact of not only the racial crisis that's happening around the world, but also the pandemic on the way that people view and relate to identity.
Yeah, I'd say right now it's not just, the one crisis, it's, pick which crisis. We've got race relations in the States, upcoming election, I think in Belarus right now, there's issues with opposition and the government firing on protesters. There's the pandemic, there's the financial crisis that's come from the pandemic. It's just, and climate change hasn't gone away, right? So it's just really difficult knowing which strand to pick right now to focus on. But I'd say for me as a Black person living in Europe, it was very clear that starting around May, June, Black Lives Matter had to be my focus. And it being my focus doesn't mean that everything else isn't equally important. Mm-hmm. But there was really, where if the pandemic is this kind of like vague, invisible threat, all of a sudden seeing, more and more Black Americans being murdered, or not just George Floyd being murdered, but hearing about Breonna Taylor being murdered, Black trans people being murdered at epidemic rates. It really sharpened my attention in June. And I think that's, people really came out onto the streets. That's the thing that many of my friends didn't expect. So, a lot of us trying to do this work on an ongoing basis thought because of the pandemic, people will stay at home, and many organizations didn't even feel comfortable asking people to go out on the streets. But and I think many others were really impressed by how much people went out onto the streets despite the pandemic, despite everything else going on, to say this just can't keep going on.
One of the things that might seem a bit weird to ask, but I'm curious to get your perspective, is when all of this started to happen, it's not like this is the first time this is happening, right? Trayvon Martin, we can kind of, rewind. There's so many folks that have really been brutalized by the system. But in this particular situation, given the pandemic, given the heightened sense of emotions, how did you personally feel when all of this conversation started bubbling up and people started taking to the streets? I'm really curious to get your take.
Yeah, so my perspective, you mentioned Trayvon Martin, and I'm trying to remember, I think that was 2013, at least, when I remember I was living in London, England, when I read that George Zimmerman had been acquitted. And so I was still living in the United States when Trayvon was murdered. And then I had left the country and was living abroad when George Zimmerman was acquitted for that murder. There's all the names have become a part of me that I can pay attention to. And there's so many more names I do not know, so many more stories I don't know. But that specific story kind of, it bridges how I left the United States to come to Europe. And so the experience of being a Black American expatriate, or I'd rather say immigrant in Europe, since that time has been really difficult to see, this is my struggle that I didn't feel like I was able to participate in or help. And that has just been an ongoing thing, right? Like it's more and more people being killed, more and more police officers being acquitted, more and more apathy towards the destruction of Black life. What changed for me this spring, personally and on an individual level, was that I was no longer grappling with these concepts kind of theoretically very far away. But when German media started talking about Black Lives Matter and specifically George Floyd's killing, it was just bizarre to see all white panels speaking about an American issue, as they called, oh, isn't it so terrible what's happening over there? We don't have these problems here. And they got away with it for maybe about a week and a half, I'd say. I don't even give them 2 weeks. I'd say they managed to push that discourse for about a week and a half before activists here were like, hold up, wait a minute. No, we've had a vibrant Afro Deutsch community here. Germany had colonies. Let us not forget the genocide against the Herero and Nama at the beginning of the 20th century. What do you mean this is only a US problem? This is a global problem. And so when that happened, I found myself able to participate in that conversation as a Black American, as a lawyer, a US trained lawyer, as someone who speaks fluent German, as a journalist working in German and English, where, I think heads started to look around and go, who can we talk to? We don't know how to kind of piece this together. And then me and many others were able to come forward and really correct the conversation to say, this is about systemic structural racism. This is about implicit bias. This is about housing, education, police reform, and it's not just a US issue. The dimensions in the United States are very different. I acknowledge that, the dimensions of seeing unarmed civilians being killed on an ongoing frequent basis, the dimensions of seeing mass shootings where civilians and other acts of domestic terror, that is in its own way distinctly US. But when we look at Germany, I always say we have to go deeper, right? So we may not see the police shooting unarmed civilians on the streets here, but there are many unexplained circumstances of Black and brown people being killed in police custody or detention. Uri Jallo is a name I always have to mention because Uri Jallo, I believe coming up on 14, 15 years, was murdered in a Dessau police cell. Uri Jallo was a migrant from Africa who was taken into custody and then set on fire in a police custody and burned beyond recognition while handcuffed to a fireproof mattress. And the official German line since that day is he set himself on fire and committed suicide while handcuffed to a fireproof mattress. And the problem here in Germany is that people accept that. Now, when I say people, I don't mean all people. Clearly, since that date, there have been activists going out to the streets every year commemorating his murder, I think in January. But that's just one story where without the availability of video, because also in his case, somehow all video and audio of his cell just disappeared around that time. We don't know what happened to it. So we have to dig beneath the surface. So I think people have this false sense of security that, oh, all these problems happening in the States don't happen to us here. It's like, actually, if you are Black, if you have a migration background, as they like to say here, if you're in police custody, you really need to worry. You need to make sure that someone knows where you are. You need to make sure you stand up for your rights. And so this conversation had always been going on. Like I said, Uri Jallo's killing was, I believe, 15 years ago. There have been activists out on the streets. but with the attention on the States, we were able to redirect it where it needed to be here. And it was just really refreshing to finally see non-white voices being given the kind of mainstream airtime to talk about all these things.
You know, I find that so refreshing to hear, but also, and hopeful, but also there's a lot of work to be done, right? Like, I feel like there's so much more that needs to go into this conversation around identity in Europe. And you know, Germany is just one country. There's definitely issues in France, let's say. The UK has its own set of issues, in Spain and Italy, so on and so forth. And I think I'm happy to be in Germany because I feel like there's a willingness now to start to engage in this conversation, which I think I find hopeful. But nonetheless, there are kind of casual, everyday acts of bias. I think there was an anecdote you shared with me about a situation at a Rossmann. Do you mind playing that back a bit?
Yes, please. So the situation has occurred, I believe, in June as well. There's a woman named Vanessa K, I believe. So German news sources don't tend to give the last names of people in news stories unless they want to. But I believe, yeah, her name is Vanessa K. She's a Black woman, a Black German woman who was checking out at the Rossmann. And she kind of just had to show her ID to use her kind of debit card. Happens, fine, whatever. It should just be a simple matter of showing the ID, matching the name on the card, continue your transaction, check out and go. And I believe she also had her young child with her at the time. So she shows the white German woman cashier her ID that matches her bank card, but the white German woman refuses to believe that this Black German woman can have an ethnically German last name. I guess she expected it to be anything other than the name that was on that ID.
Right.
She calls her a liar. The woman says, "Excuse me." And then I believe it's the cashier who calls the police to accuse this woman of fraud, that this woman has stolen someone's identity or documents or whatever, you know. Actually, you would have to go, stolen their identity so long ago that she put her face on this ID document, right? And the thing with these racist encounters is you really see how there's an easily logical explanation. This is this woman's ID.
Yeah.
But in the racist mind, warped by centuries of othering, no, that's impossible. You have to be this mastermind villain. So that's one part of it. It's bad enough that the cashier cannot believe that this woman's name on her identity document matches her actual lived experience of being a Black German woman. When the police arrives, they compound the trauma because the police officer, or at least one of the police officers who shows up on scene, kind of looks at the CCTV of what was happening and claims he's able to read lips. Again, now he has some magic powers. He's able to read lips, and this woman, he can tell she's lying. And so what you see that one instance is this woman has been othered and victimized by the staff of a major retailer. The police who come, who should be on her side as the victim of a crime, further victimize her by treating her as the aggressor and the liar. And all of this really only came to attention because she had the benefit of, while this was happening, there's a member of parliament who himself is an ethnic minority, at least in Germany, he witnesses this. And so he's able to lend kind of credence to the story that she tells, because
Right.
the third level that typically would have happened is she would have told this story and no one would have believed her.
Right.
Would she have had proof? Well, how do you know? Things are subject to misinterpretation, da, da, da. So it was the two levels. Fortunately, the third level of not believing her got caught off by this member of parliament being able to stand there and bear witness and support her. And she herself has been, I want to give her the agency as well. She came forward. She, right after it occurred in front of the Rossmann, kind of just recounted her story. Because there's this thing where we have all these videos from the United States because you can whip out your phone and start recording people. You can't do that here without keeping certain things under consideration legally. So she got around that. She said, okay, I can't record this encounter as it's happening. I'm going to go outside. I'm going to tell my story to people. And so that is how her story got out. I haven't followed to see if she's gotten an apology from the Rossmann. Typically, when these things happen, these major retailers do not apologize.
Great.
So I don't know what the follow-up in her specific situation has been, but I want to tie it back to, the structural issues. It's just a dime a dozen, because there's a Black British, his father is African American, his mother is white English woman. His name is Johnny Pitts. He's coined the term Afropean, or I should rather say he's written a book called Afropean, and the term Afropean, I think, was actually coined by some Black Belgian artists.
Okay.
Anyway, there's a community, Afropean.com. He's written this book, Afropean, where he's gathering these stories. And I like how you mentioned there's the German part, but then what is it like being, Black in Sweden? What is it like being Black in Italy or Portugal? And so all these countries that had these colonial histories that we're aware of, France, the UK, right? Spain, Portugal. But then there's so many other European countries that were equally active in colonialism that there's just a collective amnesia. All the Scandinavian countries, Germany itself. And so it's just, the really hard thing is having these conversations with, I'd say, the white European majority who really wants to believe that foreigners only recently showed up here, right, even though their nation states and borders have been shifting back and forth forever. They're, all of all of Spain was a Muslim country, I believe, for longer than it's been a Christian country. So, but people don't want to believe that. And so what I try to do here I'm a Black American, I do not have European citizenship. I'm not a German citizen, I'm a German resident. What I just try to do is share my story, interrogate, really ask, what do you believe? What's your source for that? Have you listened to this person? And just get as many of these stories out there as much as possible, through journalism, but also through comedy, because it's just absurd.
Totally absurd. I completely get you. This actually is, I think, a really good segue into thinking about, look, so you've talked a little bit about like, what are these short-term consequences of having all of this global trauma and pushing this conversation around race that's happened in the last few months. What do you think is going to happen a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Do you think that there's a possibility now for systemic change? Like, what do you think is going to be the, long-term consequences of starting this conversation?
Oh, okay. 1 year out, 3 years out. That's it's so many variables.
Yeah, sure.
I'll look back first, and then I'll try to look forward. So when I moved to Germany in 2017, so I was living in the UK for about 4 years, wanted to become British, but then Brexit threw a wrench in those plans because I really wanted to be European. So I left the UK, I moved to Germany, September 2017, just in time for the far-right party, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, just in time for the far-right party to become the largest opposition party in the German government. People like to call them the third biggest party, but we really have to call them the largest opposition party because the two biggest are in coalition together. So when I got here in September 2017, a Black, gay immigrant, I never could have imagined that I would be coming to Berlin at the same time as these far-right racists, neo-Nazis, anti-Semites, climate deniers, conspiracy theorists, that we'd all be moving to Berlin together. So I did not see that happening 3 years ago. I did not see Brexit happening. I didn't see Trump happening. I cannot imagine what life has in store for us next. I can only hope. We've got a Democratic ticket now in the United States. And what I find fascinating about German media is they're so fixated on what happens in the United States. If you go on the website of Spiegel.de, the second story is always dedicated to what's happening in the United States. So I'm going to mention that just to say that I hope that a positive outcome, which I believe is a Democratic wave in the upcoming elections in the US, will kind of wash over here because, there's these dominant narratives. So for the past 3 years after the AfD got into German's parliament, there was this dominant narrative that the far right was on the rise. The far right was resurgent. Nationalism was, the autocrats were winning against democratic pluralists. And it's an easy story to tell. And, there was the AfD, there was Brexit, there's different strands of it in different places. I am hopeful that. That was actually just a blip, right? I am hopeful that seeing where these political outcomes have led in Germany and elsewhere motivates people to look at what's happening here. There's so many things going on. I'm trying to like really choose, but for example, I just really think that like a year from now, I think we've got a new candidate for the SPD to lead them into the next election. So we really have to see where Angela Merkel is going to be stepping down, who's going to succeed her, where the party is going to position themselves. I am plugged into the activist communities here, so I know there's lots of things in the works that I don't want to kind of reveal, but there's so much activity going on. So even if we don't see it represented at a political level, at a grassroots level, I think people are getting more connected, people are getting more informed, people are learning to be more skeptical of the things they read on social media. So I think there's a literacy developing now that we did not have 4 years ago. So that makes me hopeful. And then after that, we just really have to see, I mean, demographically, the trends are on our side. That's why I earlier referred to a member of parliament who was a minority, and then I kind of hedged that and said a minority in Germany, because actually, the numbers are such that non-white people are in fact the majority of people on this planet. So why do we even use this term minority anymore, right? So Germany, I think they use the term migration background, and I think it's 25% of all people in the country have some kind of migration background. So some family history, if not their own personal history of coming from elsewhere. And those are huge numbers. It's a huge community. And so that's why I'm taking comfort from, the coalition building, the grassroots activism, all the, representation matters. I'm really seeing a shift in Germany. And I think Germany has been behind a few other countries. A few other countries are still behind us. I'm hopeful that this shift is changing the narrative. So it's not the far right on, that's resurgent, but I think specifically, actually, what's really been, the far right has not been able to position themselves on Corona. So I think if we look at trends today, the Democratic pluralists are ascendant, as they always were. I think people had this kind of like protest vote, and by people, I'm going to say white people, had a protest vote of these different parties because they felt left behind economically. So, on the racial thing, I think there's more understanding of what everyone needs to do, even if you're not personally impacted. And then economically, financially, politically, globally, as we bring all these things together, we're starting to realize you can't fix one without fixing all the others. What does climate justice look like if it's not referred? What does racial justice look like if it's not economic? That's where we are now. All those problems we're facing, we need creative solutions, and people are stepping forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really aptly. Like, there's a very complicated web of issues that are very interrelated. I think that brings me to the last question, which you started to tease a little bit in terms of your answer. But where do we go from here, right? Like the question is really, what's your advice to young people, your advice to minorities living within Europe, people who are Europeans who happen to be minorities? Like, what would be your advice for near-term, short-term, near-term, long-term, to really start to change this dialogue, right? Like to really get this conversation rolling in and around identity and culture? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have 3 simple words. Know your rights. You have to know your rights, because our rights mean nothing if we don't know them, and they still mean nothing if we don't exert them, if we don't fight for them. So I'm going to go back to something I've been talking about here in Germany a lot, which is, can you film the police? We have all these videos from the United States. Why don't we have the videos here? We don't have so many videos here because many Germans or German residents or anyone living here thinks you can't film the police. This is actually not true. You can film the police. You can film anyone in public as long as they're not sort of in a helpless state. There's one, you can't maliciously film someone if they are, the helpless state is the legal term for it. But aside from that, if you're just outside in public, you can be filming anything that happens. Germans do have the right not to be published without their consent,
Mhm.
but that is something very different from not being able to film them. So I'm just pushing that information out there because with the Vanessa Ka example, she was able to talk about it afterwards. Other people are starting to record the audio of their interactions with police officers and others. You can do this. And so that's my biggest advice, or my most important advice, my quickest advice that I can give, especially to young people. Know your rights. You're technologically savvy. You have smartphones and recording devices on you at all times for your protection. Learn the rules in France, Germany, UK, Sweden, Switzerland, wherever you are. How can I move through society? Because what we know is that when you are an other in this sphere, when you move through space, you are treated differently.
Mhm.
Um, those microaggressions, the looks, the signs of this, we deal with it on a daily basis, and we often don't know when it's going to escalate or become a problem. So know your rights around how you're being surveilled, how your information is being used, but also how you can fight back, right? Because when you have that record or that proof, people don't expect that. And when you have that proof and you fight, there's just something so empowering when you stand up for yourself and you say, no, I'm not going to be treated this way. You were wrong for these reasons. And that is something, there's no, again, because I think 28 still or 27 member states in the European Union, there's no one quick fix to say you can do this in every single country. But that's where it starts with educating yourself, knowing your rights, exerting your rights. And that's something specifically with filming the police here in Germany that we're trying to focus attention on. But there's so many other areas I'm reading about. There's, many people who've grown up here in Europe who don't have citizenship, kind of, we call them like dreamers in the United States. They're starting to come forward and tell their stories. And I think what really helps, I don't think it helps to change the minds of racists, but it helps to empower your own community. Come forward, share your story, come out of the shadows, be counted. Because when you can be counted, then you can build community. And when you build community, then you can create economic power. When you create economic power, you can create political power.
Right.
In the absence of economic and political power, there is street power. You can go out on the streets, show up to protest, be counted. So it's really like civic engagement, which I think is not very sexy. It's not very new, very modern, but that's really what it is. If you can vote, vote. If you can't vote, can you go out and protest? If you can't go out and protest for any reason, health-wise, especially because of the pandemic, can you be connected digitally? Can you be spreading information? Can you be sharing resources about how people going out to protest can protect themselves?
Right.
There's so many things, and I think what we're saying is there's a role for everyone in this. Don't get overwhelmed. Focus on what you can, act locally, think globally, and yeah, be the future.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm very energized after this conversation and hopeful for what's coming next. I really, truly believe that this is an important inflection point for us. So I'm really, really grateful for your time. Thank you so much. And I'll be including all of Joe's information below. So if you want to see more of what he's done, what he's working on, you can go check that out, as well as Daddy Magazine. So thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.